Hi, and welcome back to PDA Dads UK. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at autism and empathy and the fact that there is a stereotype that says autistic people can't feel empathy. And I'm going to examine this, why that stereotype is there, and explain how it's incorrect. So hi, welcome back to PDA Dads UK. Please, before we go on, do go hit like, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so that you know when new content's coming up. It makes a big difference just to the people who get to hear this and see this. So empathy and autism is something that comes up a lot. It comes up a lot with PDA specifically as well. It's certainly something I've seen in my daughter. My daughter can appear to have a lack of empathy when it comes to things, but other times she shows an exuberance of empathy and she can really feel what's going on. And it seems to be a chasm there that kicks in somehow. And it's been one of those things that often puzzles me as to why that is. And as I've said on so many episodes, one of my things is that I've got a good group of autistic friends, people who are actually autistic, and I can go to them and talk about these things and ask these questions and get the inside track. I've also been doing a lot of research on this lately, and I found some very interesting things out. So we're going to look at empathy. We're going to look at how it affects autistic people and how, as always, there's no one size fits all. So, as I said, my daughter can often display a lack of empathy, especially if she's been the cause, perhaps, of what's going on. So if she's had a meltdown and she's been aggressive, there's a lack of remorse that's there. She doesn't seem to process it in the right way that says, I've done something and I need to somehow put this right. I've spoken to a lot of actually autistic people. And one of the things I found is that often autistic people have what I would consider to be completely the opposite of the lack of empathy. And in fact, they feel everything. And they feel it in a really magnified, amplified way. And it's always sat as a bit of a strange oxymoron to me that we've got this stereotype that says autistic people can't feel empathy. And I've been doing a course on, understanding autism. And one of the things that's come up from that is this constant reminder that there's a lack of empathy. There's a lack of empathy. It seems to be quite outdated in a lot of its assumptions when looking at that course. So having spoken to different autistic people and got their feedback, as I say, I found that a lot of them have actually a far greater capacity for empathy than even I personally have as a neurotypical person. And this leads to a couple of things. One is that often because the sense of empathy, so, if you're not aware quite what empathy is, the idea that you can go in and you can feel somebody else's feelings or you can identify with somebody else's feelings. You feel it on their behalf. I can get this quite strongly at times, and you feel somebody else's pain or discomfort, and it makes me feel that sense of pain, that sense of discomfort. One of my autistic friends in particular has talked about this and the fact that she is what she considers herself to be an empath as a result. She feels everything that other people feel, and it can be chronically overwhelming to the point that she kind of just has to shut it off. She has to make a conscious decision to just go, you know what, I can't be feeling these things. It's affecting me too much. And so it shuts off. And that seems to be a common thing among a number of the autistic people I've spoken to, who talk about the fact that actually it's just so overwhelming. I can't process it. I can't deal with it being something that's there all the time. And I have to be able to shut it off. I have to be able to sort of shut down. And it can appear that way, that there's a lack of empathy, but it's actually not a lack of empathy. It's simply that the empathy they're feeling is so overwhelming, they've had to, one way or another, shut it down so that they can just manage their own lives and move forward in a moment. And that can come across as a lack of empathy, but it's actually the opposite. Going on from that, what can be considered a lack of empathy is also something to do with, so my daughter is a prime example of this, is the difficulty in reading other people's expressions and therefore not feeling the empathy that may come from that. So we had to spend a lot of time with my daughter with PEX cards, just going through with different facial expressions and trying to teach her what the different facial expressions meant. And in particular, anger and things like that. And my daughter can understand anger when it's there, when somebody's completely lost it and they're really angry. then she understands, oh, they're angry now. What she doesn't have is this ability to go from, read the in-between emotions that lead up to full-on anger or being upset in that way. So you can say, please stop, that's going to hurt somebody. Please stop now, stop. And it's not until you get to the stop that she will recognize that she's needing to respond to that. There's something about the subtleties, I guess, of the expressions and the intonations, if you like, that go in between, that she really struggles to process mentally and therefore put into action, that she needs to stop doing something or start doing something or respond to something in a certain way. Very challenging for her. It can be challenging for us, but it's one of those things that we've had to learn to adapt to and work around. And as I say, we try to teach those expressions, but it's still on a very surface level thing. And I don't want to be guilty of forcing her into something that just isn't her. You know, she's autistic. That's just the way her brain works. And so we had to work around that and, you know, show clearly this is the wrong thing and get her to understand early on she needs to stop something before we get to that point. Interestingly, my daughter's recently gone onto a medication now. I spoke a few episodes ago about the fact that my daughter had really escalated with the onset of puberty. Basically, she's really escalated in her behaviours, and that the doctors the psych actually who spoke to her was fantastic, and he said to me, I don't like putting kids on medications, but I can see this is really needed here. And she's on a very low dose of a medication, and it's made all the difference in the world. Her violent behaviours have really tempered themselves. You know, getting to that point where she's just being aggressive and violent has stopped. What's interesting is that her empathy has increased with it. So her ability to feel, and her own emotions in particular, but she seems to respond to other people's emotions a lot more, with that anxiety block reduced by the medication that she's on. It's just to reduce anxiety. She's really suddenly in a place where she's able to process these emotions better. It's really interesting to see. It's like suddenly without that barrier there, she's getting in touch with these things, and she's having to, you know, relearn or learn a lot of things that she probably didn't know before. Fascinating to watch, challenging for her, but also a really beautiful thing that you can see the person inside coming out that was always there. It's wonderful in that way. So we can see that autistic people can certainly feel empathy. Now, some don't. Now, this is where the chasm comes in, and this is where this stereotype comes in. Because some people don't feel empathy, and it doesn't have to be an autistic person. A lot of people don't feel empathy in those ways. It can actually be something that is a condition, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit. But some autistic people don't feel empathy, and this is something that seems to come into play. This is why the stereotype exists. Now, that's not an issue necessarily. That's not something that's wrong with them. It just means that their brain doesn't process empathy in that way. They'll have gifts in other areas that, you know, people with empathy don't have. But to say that all autistic people don't feel empathy is so wrong, because we can see from the conversations I've had with just those few people that empathy is a huge thing. The evidence is there in my daughter that she can feel empathy, and when she wants to, she can really be so warm and caring. If somebody's hurt themselves, she's the first to try and help. She really feels it, and she wants to respond to make them feel better. And she does feel those things. And when I've had those moments where, in the past, where we've had meltdowns to the point that I'm just exhausted, I've had to physically intervene, it messes me up mentally. I have to decompress after it, because who wants to be the guy who does that, you know, has to physically, you know, intervene and restrain their child. It makes me feel really low. And in those times, there have been times where I've actually been reduced to tears by it. And when that's happened, she's been the one that comes out and just wants to give me a cuddle. She somehow identifies with that. Again, it's when it's got to the extreme, but that's when it's clicked with her. She feels the empathy, and she feels it strongly when it's there. So I've been doing a lot of research on this now as well, because this is fascinating me, because this stereotype's obviously there for a reason, but it's obviously also an incorrect stereotype. It's a myth that's not true. So I did some research. I found a fantastic article on Spectrum News, and I'll put the link up in the description. Do go check it out. It's very interesting. Now, what this article covers, it was a study that was done on a condition called alexithymia. Now, alexithymia is a clinical condition they call it a subclinical condition. I don't quite know the ins and outs of that. Basically, it sort of comes under, but it seems to be something that often accompanies autism. While you don't have to be autistic to have alexithymia, people can be alexithymic without having autism. However, the incidence of alexithymia with autistic people is 5 times higher. So there is we talked about this so many times, there's so many comorbid conditions, or I hate comorbid as a word, it sounds so dark. Just co-diagnosed conditions that exist often with autism. So you often see autism and ADHD walk hand in hand, autism and PDA walk hand in hand, sensory processing disorder, all these things, they all form part of this spectrum. If you know, that's why it's called a spectrum, because there's such a vast array of different forms it can take and different co-diagnoses that can come with it. Now, alexithymia is something that's not so well known. It's not something I'd heard about till I was reading up on all this and researching it. Well, alexithymia is this condition where it actually affects emotional processing. So the ability to feel empathy is directly affected. It seems that, so this study they went into, they ended up, because they come across what I come across, basically, that there were autistic people that they were working with who were saying, oh, we feel empathy, and they could see it being played out. So there was obvious discrepancy. And what they did was go into looking at how alexithymia works with autism, but more to the point is it's actually alexithymia that's causing this stereotype to accompany it. And it seems to be the case. In fact, when they went through and did it, it was basically almost, I think it was like 100%. They could see that it was alexithymia that was affecting people who were autistic to be unable to process this empathy toward other people. And so that was where this thing comes from. It's actually a side condition, an extra condition, something that goes alongside autism that creates this. So not all autistic people are alexithymic. Many autistic people, as I say, are completely the opposite. And I wonder if it's, you know, you get that pendulum, don't you? And it's one side, there's this extreme to the other side where people feel this overwhelming sense of empathy to the point that it is overwhelming and they need to be able to shut off from it. And some people can't. And so they constantly walk around with this air, and it's exhausting. From the people I've spoken to, it's something that is just constantly draining. So alexithymia seems to be something that accompanies autism in some cases as a co-diagnosed condition. And I think this makes sense. We know that autism rarely comes as a package on its own. An autistic person usually isn't just autistic. There's usually other things that go alongside it. And it's that difficulty of breaking things down into labels and what's actually autism and what's actually other things and how do they all mix together. And basically, you know, it's like the world's biggest Venn diagram, and you've got these circles everywhere and all these, you know, slithers crossing everywhere where all these things cross over. There are so many co-diagnosed conditions, and it seems alexithymia is one that is rarely understood, not commonly talked about, but it can actually affect this side of things. So if you're dealing with an autistic child or a person who you're caring for, or just working with, talking with, being friends with, family members, whatever, if there's a lack of empathy there, it's likely, it seems, that this is alexithymia alongside the autism. And so being autistic doesn't mean that you are going to necessarily be someone who lacks empathy. And as I say, often it's the complete opposite. I found this whole thing fascinating to look into because it explains so much. When you actually identify that there's something separate that can accompany, then you can understand why this myth exists, why this stereotype exists. But it's a stereotype that's incorrect, and it's a stereotype that needs to stop. Because what happens is people get lumped into these boxes. Oh, you're autistic, therefore you can't feel any empathy, or you don't feel empathy and you get sort of shut off. But actually that's not the case. And we need to understand that. And it comes with this problem that we see so often that the companies is that the lack of understanding that's accompanied autism until, you know, fairly recently, and even now is still pervasive. It's one of those things that's getting better as time goes on. But, you know, no two autistic people are the same. No two people on earth are the same. And everybody will be different and have different responses. We know that the mind works differently for an autistic person. It's a different way of processing the world. I'm running on iOS and an autistic person might be running on Android, and they're just different systems processing the same information, but the outcome is often slightly different. I did my talk on guitar and the different ways that, you know, different guitars can have an effect. It's the same input, they're the same music, but it interprets it differently with different guitars and different sounds and stuff like that. It comes out differently. This is what's going on, and it's a broad spectrum, and the assumption that we can fit every autistic person, every neurodiverse person into a box that fits certain criteria is never going to happen. The same way that you can never fit any one person into a box and say this is who they are and what they are and it ticks all these boxes. It's why the diagnosis process is so challenging, and this is becoming understood more and more. And we see it with, you know, the fact that more girls are coming forward now and being diagnosed as being autistic is so important, because what we're seeing is it's different in the different sexes, in the different genders. The way that autism is expressed, or the way the mind reflects it, is just different. You get masking and you get all these things that accompany it. So it's really interesting, and I would challenge you to look to people and talk to autistic people and say and find out how they feel. Do they feel empathy? It's been a fascinating conversation I've had with a number of people. I recommend you go and do it. Finding things out from the source, from autistic people themselves who have the inside track and know these things internally, and because they live it every day, is such a blessing, and it's something that I really recommend everybody does. Thanks so much for joining me. I'd love to hear your experiences. If you are autistic yourself and you think you may have alexithymia, or you do know that you have alexithymia, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what your experiences are like and how you work around that. And, you know, because it's a fascinating area. Likewise, if you're a parent or a carer, if there's someone in your life who's autistic and is alexithymic as well, I'd love to hear your feedback. But also, I'd really love to hear from autistic people who aren't alexithymic, who do feel these emotions, do feel empathy toward other people, and it can be overwhelming. I'd love to hear your experiences, and as I say, it's something we can mold into another episode later on, where we take these experiences and put them together and string something along those lines. Please do hit like, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so that you know when new content's coming up. I will see you again on the next episode. In the meantime, stay safe.